Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. We've been on a bit of a break. I went on vacation last week, so I meant to do a video that would fill you in on that 2 weeks ago, but due to working some overtime, I never quite got around to recording that. We wound up just having a blank period there. Not really a big deal, but in case you were wondering where I went, that's what happened. So we are back and we're looking again at 20th Century Boys because um, well, I'm really kind of behind where I wanted to be on this. We are in July now, and we're only on volume 5, and I believe this is a 12 volume series, so a little bit of catching up to do there. So expect to see more of these videos as we go forward. In the meantime, when we last looked in on things, the showdown at Shinjuku Catholic Church had just taken place, and we got some very interesting revelations there. We saw how the FDP and our friend were once again using public perception and uh, these weird childhood games to kind of try and shape the course of the world, which is rather unsettling to have a kid's daydreams be taken so seriously. One of the things about the way a children thinks is that it is so self-centered. It has no understanding of the impacts their actions can have on other people. And this lack of responsibility is understandable in childhood. One of the purposes of childhood is to train you to develop those those kinds of thoughts. Clearly, our friend and most of his allies never quite got that. We're going to look at one of those characters in depth today, and I promised to talk a little bit more about Sadakiyo when he came up. That time is just about now, but I'm going to save my thoughts on him until the end. But he's on the cover of this volume because this is really the part of the story where he is most important. He's a little bit in the next volume, but I'm going to discuss his entire story arc here. So if you don't want spoilers, well, probably you're not watching this series to begin with, but if you don't want spoilers, I would recommend stopping now and reading the beginning of volume 6 if you haven't already, and then coming back and watching this. So let's talk about the second half of this volume. Picking up where we left off, we got the revelation that Kana's mother is returning, and this is important to the FDP for some reason. Acho, the shogun, was going after number 3, the assassin, and we had this momentary reunion of some very important characters in our cast, and now they are kind of going their separate ways again. When I first read this, I remember thinking, oh, that's really disappointing because I was looking forward to these characters that I really liked coming back together and once again driving the story forward. And that is going to happen, but not right away. We are going to make a small side trip, which is really the rest of this volume. But the point is, that is happening. We're just not quite there yet. And actually, this kind of passing meeting rings pretty true to life. It is true that the people you know come and go a lot more than you think they do, unless it's your close family or perhaps your best friend. People come and go in your life quite a bit. So as I've gotten older, as I've gotten outside, because I first read this in college, which is of course a very unique environment, a very unnatural environment, if you ask me, much like school, all forms of school are. And especially socially, it doesn't really prepare you for the way real life works. So when I first read this, I found that this coming and going to be very disappointing and upsetting. Now that I am older, it makes much more sense to me. It is very clear that this is one of the things Urasawa is trying to do in this story is show the difference between what we thought the world was like when we were young and what it actually works like when you are an adult, and the importance of reconciling those things so that the good ideals you had when you were young you can continue to pursue around the far more difficult and complex nature of adult life. And maybe I'm reading a little bit too deeply into this particular coming and going, um, but I think that overall, this meeting and parting of the main characters is a big part of that theme. And it's not one that requires a lot of dialogue or exposition. It's just the reality is these people, once they have grown up, they have developed different specialties, different skills, um, different personal connections that do draw them away from each other, but they can still come back together when they need to, or when circumstances permit. And having those kinds of friendships in life is really great. I have close friends that I don't see on a very regular basis just because our schedules don't meet up. But when we have the opportunity to get together, we still have and enjoy a very good relationship. Recently, I got a chance to see a friend who he and his wife had a baby, and between that and COVID, we didn't see them for almost a year. But when they came back and were able to come to a get together, it was almost as if they had not been gone at all. Because, I mean, when you're an adult, those friendships can be stronger. It's one of the upsides. Anyways, I don't know if that's just me babbling about it or what, but there are a lot of elements about this relationship that I really like, and this was a moment when, looking back at it as I reread it now and remembering how I thought about 20th Century Boys when I was younger, because it has been a while since I've read this story, even though I like it a great deal. Coming back and looking at it now, I reacted to it in a very different way, I think. And this is the moment when I read it, college student, and I thought, man, that was really disappointing. And I read it now, and I'm like, oh no, this is the way life is. So yeah, a very different reaction. And I think one of the signs of great art is that you can read that art or experience that art, if it's a painting or something like that, and have very different reactions at different points in your life. And you can actually learn from the differences in the way you react to that piece of art. You can learn something, and I think that's one of the signs. Rereading this story now, that this is really a great story, not just a good one, but a great one. That I see it from these different perspectives, and have a better understanding of it. I also want to note this is a very little thing. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it on the camera here very clearly, but this rope here, the way it leads in from off the side of the page, I really like that composition. I don't know why, but it's these little details in Urasawa's composition that really jump out at me. The way he uses his panels to draw attention to things, to highlight things, I think it's really great. And as I read this, it's one of the things I really try and study. Urasawa doesn't use some of the more modern visual storytelling techniques like very prominent sound effects. In fact, as you read this, sound effects are very rare in this. He's not Hirohiko Araki. He doesn't integrate them deeply into his composition. Instead, he has this way of setting up his panels, the way they go full bleed, or occasionally a single element will come out of them, that really highlights important things and makes it just visually more interesting, even though actually his style is kind of simple. He actually, and I've said this before, but I'll say it again, Urasawa is a very efficient draftsman. He can do a lot with just a few lines, and I really appreciate that about him. Okay, let's talk let's talk a little bit about the actual story in here. After Acho and his mangaka buddy go their own way chasing number 3, Kana comes together with the boss of the Thai and Chinese mafia, and they strike a truce. Of course, as soon as we saw these two particular groups of criminals rallying around Kana, you probably saw this coming. Kana has already met both of these men once and succeeded in negotiating with them. She did it not through some kind of not some kind of principled lecture or Mary Sue, everyone loves me. She established a rapport with them through something very simple they could all appreciate, and now she is building on that through signs of her personal courage and integrity. And that is a great way to show character progression, or not really progression, but to illuminate a character. Kana actually has a fairly flat arc. Her major character beats all come in her ability to relate to Detective Cho and authority figures, which he has always been very skeptical of, and But to understand her character, we see the way people react to her actions. We get a better insight into her by watching how she positions herself to influence others. Because just like her father, she is very good at that. But like her uncle, she tries to use this in um, a very deliberate and altruistic way instead of a very narcissistic way. Okay, so after this, people go their separate ways. The police show up and they're worried about this situation, but Detective Cho goes out and he's able to defuse it. He is progressing as a character. He is, now that we know, of course, that the policeman with the mole was using the shotgun to murder people who were in the FDP's way. Cho has become very skeptical. Well, not very skeptical, but a little more skeptical of the police that he is a part of, and he is willing to gloss over some things, maybe tell little white lies, as you might say, to make life easier. And he kind of smooths things over with the police, and he prevents this from turning into a 9-alarm fire. In the meantime, Kana and Yukiji escape, and they go to the ramen restaurant that makes the famous ramen that brought the mob bosses together. And there's a really nice moment where we see Yukiji trying to repair her relationship with Kana that has been very rocky pretty much the whole time we've seen them in this modern era of 2014. And it's a nice capstone to Kana's latest story arc in 20th Century Boys. And it's impactful, but this is not her major moment of emotional development. So I'm going to leave. Kana has a couple of character arcs here, and she's on her way to ending one right now. As you may have guessed, with what just happened, it has to do with her mother, Kenji's sister, and it's not really addressed in this volume. So we're going to talk more about it in the next volume where it is resolved. Just keep that in mind. The only parental figure that Kana has really acknowledged ever has been Kenji. And the fact is, other people have been trying to fill in the holes she has in her mentor figures. Yukiji is one of them. Of course, the Chinese cook whose name escapes me. I don't know if he's ever named. But the owner of the restaurant that Kana works for is another one. And Kana has been very cool to a lot of the offerings of assistance she gets there. Be that as it may, again, I will talk more about Kana as we resolve some of those issues in the next volume. For now, I think this beat with Yukiji is really nice, and it shows that she is beginning to make a little more room in her heart for these people who have tried to be parental figures to her, but she's never really accepted. Because again, Kana's issue is she hates authority figures that aren't Kenji. And honestly, she hasn't had Kenji in her life since she was 5 or 6, so it's questionable whether she really appreciates any authority figure. It's far more likely, although we don't really see a whole lot of how she thinks about Kenji in the modern day, the flashbacks we get could be somewhat idealized. It's not clear whether Kenji is a real meaningful influence on her now, or what we see is just a daydream that she has put together to help her hold together emotionally. I think it's authentic. I do think that. And we'll talk more about that when Kana and Kenji actually meet again. I guess that's a bit of a spoiler, but anyways. Let's talk about the beginning of Kyomi's next character arc. Now, Kyomi is, of course, the girl that Kana met and who went to Tomodachi Land or Friend Land, depending on how you want to call it. And she comes back into the story in a very interesting way. We actually begin with a flashback to the state of Mississippi early in the 20th century. When Robert Johnson came to a crossroads, he made a deal with the devil. He learned to play guitar and gave birth to rock and roll. And then at the age of 27, he was poisoned. And Robert Johnson is generally acknowledged as the first member of the 27 Club, a large group of musicians who died, unfortunately, at the age of 27 after recording some music that would make them very famous. The probably two best known members of the 27 Club are Kurt Cobain and Jimi Hendrix. But there are a lot of other musicians in this club as well. So much so, of course, that it's kind of a thing when you talk about musicians. So we cut from this little factoid and a shot of Kenji playing guitar in this flashback to a picture of the band Koyomi follows, the Elohim SEMs. This is clearly some kind of Kabbalic reference, but I'm not sure exactly what it means. I'm not really an expert on the Kabbalah, but they're a band. In this story, all that really matters is they're a band Kiyomi follows, and it turns out that in the time she was away at Friendland and dodging the authorities, one of their members left due to irreconcilable differences. This is one of those things that happens in the music industry. And Kiyomi is kind of curious why that happens. And he claims to have met the devil at a crossroads, which is a very interesting thing that to think about, because he met the devil at a crossroads. He would go on these long guitar riffs, completely changed by this. And he says the devil was always watching him. And for Kiyomi, that triggers memories of course, the Dream Navigators and her time in Friendland. And she becomes convinced that they are monitoring her. And she continues to have flashbacks as well to the VR program she was in and what happened to her there. Eventually, her memories return because she didn't remember much of her first trip to the VR program. The only thing she doesn't remember is the face that was under the mask. She just remembers that it was horrible and out of this world. So eventually, Kiyomi goes back to school and find out that she's going to be getting a new English teacher, a bunch of other little details that you don't think a whole lot about at first. And then Kana comes back to school. She's made an agreement with Yukiji to go back to school. And this is where, once again, our worlds start to come together. Kiyomi had heard Kana's name. I don't think she had ever actually seen her before. But now she's met Kami-sama and she's met Yoshitsune. She has a very personal connection to Kana, even though they've never talked directly. And she decides maybe it's time to extend the network. And I don't think that a lot of conscious thought went into this. Kiyomi is a creature of impulse. She does whatever she thinks about doing. She says whatever comes into her mind. That's not a great character trait for someone in her situation to have, but in this case, it's going to do good for her because it takes a little bit. She has to be a little forceful, but she will eventually forge this relationship with Kana, which is going to be very important to her because it's part of what's going to keep her alive. In the meantime, we see Kami-sama come to the ramen restaurant. And of course, we know he's been there before because he ordered ramen that he left at the memorial. And he meets up with Yukiji there. And they continue to talk, they continue to plan, they continue to think about what the right thing to do is. There's only a couple of pages of this meeting here. And there's a lot of Japanese people, Asian societies in general, are not very direct in their social interactions. They do a lot of things by implication. They try to be very roundabout so as not to offend anyone. You live very crammed in these societies, very cheek to jowl, and it's important to maintain social harmony in that kind of situation. But here, the dialogue goes a level above. Clearly, they both know the other is trying to accomplish something against the FDP, and they're trying to do it without drawing any attention. So they exchange some words to that effect. Very well used dialogue, I think, but also not enough to really tell you what's going on. And I think that's less a deliberate obfuscation on Urasawa's part and more an attempt to show the kind of doublespeak that people in this kind of situation would have to use. I like it, but other than establishing that Kami-sama and Yukiji are aware of each other, it doesn't establish a whole lot. And I don't know if it goes to the point of being a pacing issue, but there are occasional moments like this through here where I wonder, was this scene really necessary? Did it need to be as long as it was? I think in this case, establishing that these two are in communication with each other is kind of important, or at least in communication with each other again, because it is established here that Yukiji suspected that Kami-sama was the famous millionaire who was doing charity work among the homeless, but they never actually got in contact again, partly because I think Yukiji was afraid of Kami-sama's very high media profile, which he established once he became a millionaire. Anyways, we go back to Kyoko. She's observing Kana. This chapter is entitled Surveillance, and it kind of bobbles back and forth between Kiyomi's flashbacks to the VR program and the Dream Navigators, and her fears about being surveilled, and of course her own surveillance of Kana. And what this establishes really is that while Kiyomi is impulsive and she blabs her mouth sometimes, she's not an incompetent stalker, for lack of a better way to put it. She does, we have a kind of 2-page montage here of her surveilling Kana and learning very accurate information about her, from which she draws mostly correct conclusions. So it's actually kind of impressive. Either Yoshitsune taught Kiyomi more than we thought, or she just has a knack for collecting gossip, and she might actually make a decent private investigator in the future. Regardless, we get another introduction of the Hello Expo singer guy. His name is Haru Namio. And this is a really clever use of 2 panels, because it reminds us of Haru after he was introduced in the previous volume in Tomodachi Land. Again, he's an important character, but he's not important yet. And that's this kind of gradual setup is a very impressive work on Urasawa's part. But beyond that, it also triggers a flashback in Kiyomi, who is thinking back to her time in Tomodachi Land, where she first saw this. It upsets Kana, who wants this turned off because, of course, she hates the FDP. And it also serves as an excellent introduction to the Dream Navigator, who shows up rather upset to learn that Kiyomi has been following Kana around. Of course, we know why that is. Kiyomi kind of understands why it is. She knows that Endo Kana is important to Yoshitsune, but I don't think she realized she was important to the FDP as well. Otherwise, maybe she wouldn't have done this. Regardless, this results in the Chief Dream Navigator scheduling Kiyomi for a trip to Friend World, Tomodachi World. And of course, having already been to Friendland, Kiyomi doesn't want to go to Friend World. And especially not with the recommendation of she's been a very bad girl. That's, again, I talk about Urasawa being a very efficient draftsmanship. That is such a sinister expression with just a handful of lines. Very good work, again. Unfortunately, for the Dream Navigators, there's a waiting list for Friend World, and Kiyomi can't go right away. In the meantime, we are introduced to the new teacher. We are told several chapters before that Kiyomi's going to get a new teacher, and here he is. There's a kid getting bullied, and he shows up a little bit too late to do anything. And that's how we're introduced to Sadakiyo. He's a teacher. He's not a very good teacher. And he's about to meet Kiyomi, and that's going to make a very big difference in her life. Now, you could say this was a coincidence, but it's not really. It's not just blind chance that puts such an important person as Sadakiyo in Kyomi's school. He's there because Kana goes to that school, because the principal has connections to the Dream Navigators, things we will see as we go through the story. And that means that he's most likely there as part of the ongoing effort to keep tabs on Kana. And of course, the fact that the FDP has Kana under tabs, under surveillance, is what results in Kyomi winding up in trouble. Now, she goes out and she goes to this telephone booth to contact Yoshitsune, which makes sense because, you know, they've been in contact before. And Kyomi tells him that she did remember some things from the VR program and that she's met Kana. And that Kana is doing well. And we never actually see how Yoshitsune reacts to this, but it sounds like he has a strong emotional reaction because Kyomi asks if he's crying at learning this. And that makes sense. Yoshitsune was always the most emotional of the kids when we saw them in their younger time periods. And now, yes, Yoshitsune is the leader. Amazingly, he is the one who is leading an organization and seems the best equipped to do so. But he's still emotional, and it's nice to see that part of him is still there and asserts itself at major moments of trial. Anyways, this is after this, we finally get the revelation of who Sadakiyo is, and there's a really great way this is done. He comes in to teach English. He walks up to the desk, and we see this, his introduction and Kyomi's face interspersed with these flashbacks to the VR program. And finally, we see Kyomi freaking out and screaming at the end of the chapter. It's a great end to the chapter, and we get the horror explained. Sadakiyo never had a good picture of himself taken as a student, so in order to make his face for the VR program, they took his adult face and they just slapped it on the model because, well, Sadakiyo wears that mask most of the time anyways. They figured no one's ever going to see that. Now, you do eventually see this figure, you know, the kid with the adult's head on it that Kyomi saw, and it's not really that disturbing. And again, this is one of the things that I really couldn't figure out the first time I read this. Why seeing that might cause people to freak out and commit suicide. And clearly, it seems clear to me now, looking back on it, that they didn't actually commit suicide. The FDP just used that as an excuse to assassinate these people who they feared might have seen too much. So, again, that was one thing I couldn't figure out. And looking back on it, it now makes more sense. I don't know if I just had bad translations when I read it or what, but it makes more sense now. And I know I spoke earlier on as I was doing the reread before I got to this point of how strange I saw some things about the VR situation being. And while I still have those issues, as I said in my last video, that particular one is one I've moved past. So I just wanted to mention that again, in case anyone had missed it. So Kyomi passes out, and then she wakes up again. We see her with Kana, and there's this an interesting byplay here where Kyomi is kind of calmed down, and Kana tries to, you know, help her stop freaking out and figure out what she was talking about. And they kind of make a connection there. And it's a really good scene. Of course, it results in, there it is. That's the thing she saw when the kid took the mask off. And Kana runs off to try and find the new teacher because she's worried he may be dangerous. In the meantime, Kyomi goes back to the classroom, get her stuff, and go home. She's very confused. Again, Kyomi is impulsive, so she just does whatever comes into her mind. She probably would have been safer sticking with Kana, but instead she goes back to the classroom and she meets Sadakiyo, and Sadakiyoshi, which is his actual name. Again, Sadakiyo, um, just like Maro and Yoshitsune and Karoyan. These are all nicknames. Sadakiyo does the favor of telling us that his nickname was Sadakiyo, and that's why that's what everyone else calls him. He's generally known as Sada-san by the faculties, and I think normally Urasawa does not have the characters explain their nicknames to us, but in this case, because Sadakiyo has a very important civilian role, so to speak, that he has a lot of peers who don't address him by his nickname. I think this is done just to let us know to associate these two names. And of course, Kana is under the impression, and so is Kiyomi, that Sadakiyo is our friend, which he's not. And this is when that really begins to become clear. Of course, we saw in the flashback to Bloody New Year's Eve that that's what Kenji thought as well. But pretty much from the moment he's introduced as this kind of inept teacher who can't even, help a student out as he's being bullied, it's clear that Sadakiyo is not our friend. He doesn't have the charisma. He doesn't have the sense of timing. He doesn't have the confidence. Sadakiyo is always smiling in a very creepy way, and it's creepy because it's insincere. We can tell this is an attempt to kind of cover over for a person who's not sure of his place in the world. And that becomes clearer and clearer as time goes on. There's this a perfect example of this when Kiyomi sees his the ornament he has in his car. It's Tetsujin 28, and she mistakes it for Gundam, which really upsets Sadakiyo. He becomes angry. He yells at her. We realize immediately that Sadakiyo has these wild mood swings, and that, when I first read this, that was the moment I was sure Sadakiyo was not Friend, because Friend is always in control of himself. And of course, Sadakiyo is not Friend. This also reveals that Fukube, who tackled the person wearing Sadakiyo's mask during Bloody New Year's Eve, that was a foolish move on his part. Maybe. So it seems. Because he was not dealing with the real Sadakiyo. Even if Sadakiyo was Friend, that wasn't him. Because, of course, they both fell to the ground, and we saw bodies there after the fall. And clearly Sadakiyo did not die then, because he's still here in 2014. So Sadakiyo was originally driving Kiyomi home, but after this blow up about Tetsujin 28, Sadakiyo accuses her of not knowing anything about old manga, but Kiyomi read some Ashido no Jo when she was hiding in the secret base back during the simulation. So she mentions that, but she never got to finish the manga. So Sadakiyo offers to take her somewhere she can finish the series, his house. And that's where a lot of the rest of this takes place. We see Sadakiyo's house as a shrine. He's obsessed with the things of his past. Perhaps not surprising, because we have seen him working with the FDP. And in fact, it turns out that he is a member of the FDP. The house they are in is in fact our friend's house, and Sadakiyo is the curator of it, because it's a museum now. It belonged to our friend, after all. And Sadakiyo has been kind of bullied and pushed along by our friend. He's been manipulated, as many other people have been, but he's also gone into it with his eyes open. And a lot of his lack of confidence results from the way he's been bullied. And when he first met our friend, he thought, hey, this guy is actually my friend. And he did drive off all the other bullies, but Turns out our friend was the biggest bully of them all, and he has continually made Sadakiyo feel worthless. He's a very manipulative and abusive person, and he's convinced Sadakiyo he couldn't be anything without our friend there to help him along. And Sadakiyo, of course, knows that Kyomi is on her way to Tomodachi World, and having talked to this girl, he finds he can't just leave her alone. And this is the catalyst for Sadakiyo to break some of that conditioning. There's an interesting build-up to this. We hear Sadakiyo yelling at his mother, almost as if this was an episode of Psycho, and there's clearly some tributes to that in the way that's constructed. But Sadakiyo did have one other person that helped him with the bullies, and that was his own teacher when he was in school. His teacher was not very competent. He only got to Sadakiyo after the bullying was over, just like Sadakiyo did with his own student in his introduction. But Sadakiyo is proud of his role as a teacher. He's trying to emulate this teacher that helped him so much. So he decides he's going to stand up for Kyomi. And when the Dream Navigators come to the house, he threatens to burn it down. And, of course, since it's a piece of national history, they don't want that to happen. So he's able to stage an escape, basically by taking, this museum hostage. However, Sadakiyo is not entirely a good character. We're going to get more of that later on, but early on, we get the feeling that while Sadakiyo has been bullied and manipulated a lot, he's not above manipulating people either. He's worried that Kyomi is going to bail on him, and serving as her teacher is his emotional crutch. It gives him the strength to stand up to our friend and, break out of the bullying he's receiving. But he doesn't seem certain he can continue to do that on his own, so he ensures that Kyomi will stick with him by showing her a picture of Kenji's sister first, and then picture of our friend. Yeah, Kana knows who he is, or at least what he looked like when he was a student. And that's a very clever, dastardly, manipulative thing to do. Again, Sadakiyo, he has a good heart, but he has been very twisted over the years. He has suffered a lot of emotional abuse from bullies in general and from our friend in particular. And while he makes this gambit, he threatens to burn down the house and eventually escapes in his souped-up motor car. He's not sure what to do after that. And he tells one of the signs of a person who is unstable and probably untrustworthy is that they reveal a lot to people younger than them in an attempt to get validation. And that's exactly what Sadakiyo does here. Now, all of the characters from Kenji's friend group have moments of vulnerability and intimacy with the younger characters. The continuity of generations is an important part of this story, after all. But in the case of every character other than Sadakiyo, this is part of an attempt to counsel and guide and build up the younger characters. Only Sadakiyo does it because he doesn't know what to do, and he needs some kind of affirmation from Kyomi. And Kyomi, of course, is ill-equipped to give this validation to him, but he does mention he had a teacher that he looked up to, of course, his own teacher, and Kyomi convinces Sadakiyo to go and meet this teacher. They eventually find him at a retirement home. This retirement home is surrounded by the Dream Navigators, because, of course, they're chasing Kyomi. And then, finally, after 4 or 5 chapters since we've seen her, we finally cut back to Kana. Kana is driving with the principal in the car, and they're trying to find where Sadakiyo is, because Kana is worried about Kyomi, and the principal is worried about Sadakiyo. But What it happens here is, as part of this natural conversation, the principal winds up revealing to Kana that her father is our friend. Of course, we knew that already, but it turns out that Kana did not. And she has kind of a mental break at this. She already had very poor relations to all of the parental figures in her life, and this is likely to make them even worse. And we get one of those flashes of weirdness here that comes around our friend and, of course, Kana, his daughter, a sign that not everything about these people is strictly normal. There's a lightning strike. We're not sure if it hits the car or if the control panel just explodes for mysterious reasons. We see a moment of spoon bending. This is something that is generally associated with the weird and paranormal abilities of Kana and our friend, and of course Kami-sama, who predicts the future. So we're not sure whether the car was struck by lightning in a freak accident or whether Kana manipulated the car in some way. But at the end of it, we get this shot of Kana just being totally shell-shocked. And that is our cliffhanger for this volume. It ends a very eventful part of the story. There is a lot of plot that happens here. And we don't get very much character development for anyone other than Sadakiyo, which is understandable because, of course, he's just been introduced to us, so we need to learn some things about him. This part of the story, I remember it being longer than it actually is. And I think the reason for that is just because so much happens here. Usually Urasawa moves his story at a slightly slower pace than this. And he lets us get more of those good reaction shots and those emotional beats. But there's a lot that has to happen here before we can get the ultimate payoff. And those are coming at the beginning of the next volume. What he's focused on right now is building up Sadakiyo. We aren't getting any payoffs for that yet. I remember him being a bigger character in the story than it turns out he actually was. Probably because we got all of his development very crammed together. If you've read the rest of the story, you know that up until this point, we really only got this kind of development very condensed into one spot for one other character, and that's Acho. And I think that is interesting because Sadakiyo is kind of our friend's Acho. He's not actually Acho, but he fills a position very similar to that. He was a very close friend to our friend when they were young. And really looks like Kenji and Acho were the two closest members of Kenji's circle when they were young. Now, Sadakiyo is not our friend's right hand. That's Menjome. The truth is Sadakiyo is not competent enough to be anyone's right hand. He is pretty inept in a lot of the things he tries to do. That doesn't make him bad, just a little bit bumbling. He wouldn't be the first person you relied on for anything. But the reality is all of this payoff, it hasn't landed yet. And while I like the cliffhanger of Kana finding out who her father is, that's something we as an audience already knew. And I think if I could just cut the story anywhere that I wanted to, I probably would have cut this story at Kiyomi learning what our friend looks like, even if only as a child. Because that feels like more of a revelation to us, the audience. I am interested in seeing how Kana will react to finding out that our friend is her father. And that was probably a good cliffhanger for a chapter, but as a whole volume, I don't know. Of course, these volumes just have a fixed length, and you can only write to that fixed length so much if you're looking to tell an effective story. So, I think this is kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of another. The pacing in this part of the story is still pretty good, but I think it's a little shakier just because we don't get that big payoff for the audience anywhere in this volume. Or at least the second half of this volume, because we did see Acho, Kana, and Yukiji all come together at Shinjuku Catholic. But that doesn't really feel like the climax of the book, because it's not. And while it was the climax of that story arc, Sadakiyo is really the focus of this book, as you can kind of gather by him being on the cover. So it's a good volume. It has some really good moments in them, but I really don't think these are the strongest moments in the series. Seeing Sadakiyo turn on the FDP is a pretty impactful moment, and I liked it. But this is not one of the strongest parts of the story, in my personal opinion. Kiyomi is never a character I would place anywhere in my favorites, not even probably in the top half of the cast. So the parts of the story that focus heavily on her, I kind of don't like. Her initial story arc I like a lot more because it has Yoshitsune in it, who is a very good character. Sadakiyo is kind of pathetic, and while he's an important character to understand, to see into the mind of our friend, having him be the climax of this arc kind of lame to me. So yeah, this is the middle of the story, and middles of the story can always feel a little bit flat because they have very few payoffs of their own. Usually they are, picking up threads from the beginning or laying down threads for the end. And that's, lots of people love The Empire Strikes Back in Star Wars. I kind of hate it just because it has that same syndrome, even though it does have some very excellent scenes in it. That's all that said, this is still good. It's not great compared to other parts of the story, but it is great compared to a lot of other manga out there. So it's very difficult to judge this part of the story on its own merits. Still, it is necessary to get some of the big payoffs that we're going to see going forward. And there are still a lot of good, strong payoffs coming. We'll talk about that more as we go forward. And until then, I hope you enjoyed this. It's quite the long video, longer than I thought it would be. There is a like button and a subscribe button down below. You can use those as you see fit. And I will talk to you later.